We finished up on Tuesday talking about Savonarola. I did a couple of the things that we talked about in class on Tuesday. I wanted to make comments about as we're getting started here today. I did look a little bit into the burning of Wycliffe's bones. He was condemned as a heretic in 1415 by the Council of Constance. I believe it was in May of 1415 that they denounced him as a heretic. But it was not until 1428 that Martin V, who was the pope that was elected by the Council of Constance, actually followed through on that edict and had Wycliffe's bones dug up and burned. So why it took Martin V that long, I'm not entirely sure, but he was condemned at the council and then burned in 1428. And there is a woodcut depiction of the burning of Wycliffe's bones in Fox's Book of Martyrs. So if you want a graphic presentation of what that might have looked like, you can find it in Fox. Also, found out that the word Barba, that's what it is, Barba, it does not mean uncle in Italian, but it does mean uncle in a Piedmontese dialect, which I can't even pronounce correctly, Genovese or something like that. Josh and I were talking about it on Tuesday afterwards. So there is a particular dialect where Barba does mean uncle, and that's why you guys are like, what? Did I miss that? If you remember from class on Tuesday, we were talking about how the Waldensian church leaders were referred to by the term uncle rather than the term father, and I had to go back and look at exactly what dialect the term barba, which is what was actually used, meant uncle, since in Italian proper, the word barba means beard and doesn't mean uncle. So just wanted to clarify that. I think also that when we were talking just at the end of class on Tuesday that I was mentioning some of the humanists, and I mentioned the German humanist. I was supposed to say Johann Reuchlin. I don't know if I said Johann Reuchlin. For some reason, in my mind, thinking back, I think I might have accidentally inserted the word of, or the name of, the German liberal Albrecht Ritschl, who is a completely different person in church history who we'll talk about later. He's kind of the architect of the social gospel. So this is my corrections and retractions portion of the class, I suppose, but just thinking back to what I said on Tuesday, if I said Albrecht Ritschl, it was completely wrong. Johann Reuchlin is the one that I was thinking of and the one that I intended to say, and I'm not sure exactly what I did say, but it's on video for anyone and everyone to see, so need to make sure that I correct those things. Speaking of Johann Reuchlin, there are several humanists that you need to know as we work our way through this class. I only have one of them listed in the notes, and that's Jacques Lefebvre, but there are two others that I need to tell you about just a little bit. Johann Reuchlin, who lived from, 1455 to 1522, and then John Colette, who lived roughly the same time, 1455 to 1536, and then we have Jacques Lefebvre, who is listed there in the notes, also around 1455, and his dates go as well to 1536. So these three men's lives overlap with one another. But these three men are known as humanists, and really what we have during this time period, right at the outset of the Reformation, is the rise of humanism. When we hear the word humanism, we automatically think something negative because we think of the secular humanists like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and those new atheists. That's what I think of when I think of the word humanism. But initially, humanism was not a bad thing. Humanism was a good thing. It was a recovery of the humanities. In some way, it was kind of an extension, I suppose, of the Renaissance. It was a recovery of the great antiquities of Greek and Roman literature, and it included with it a rediscovery of the biblical texts in Greek and also in Hebrew. This is going to become very, very important because one of the key themes that I've tried to emphasize in discussing the Reformation is that the Reformation is the result of the Word of God being rediscovered and then being translated into the languages of the people so that the common lay people have access to the Scriptures. I mean, that really explains the Reformation. Why Reformation? Because the Word of God started to change people's lives, and when individual lives are changed en masse, it changes the entire landscape of countries and continents. So we have these three men. Johann Reuchlin is a German, and he was at the University of Basel and then ended up at Heidelberg. And he is significant because he emphasized the recovery of studying the Old Testament in Hebrew. That was one of his main contributions to this time period. Before this, people had been content to study the Old Testament in Latin or perhaps in Greek, even going all the way back to Augustine. Augustine didn't think it was really that necessary to study Hebrew. He was content with the Septuagint, which of course is the Greek translation of the Old Testament that was done before Christ by Jewish scholars in Alexandria, Egypt. Jerome, the contemporary of Augustine, thought Augustine was crazy for thinking that way and insisted that no, we must get back to the Hebrew language since that is the language that God inspired the Old Testament in. Reuchlin recovers the study of biblical Hebrew, and the reason you study Hebrew today is in part due to Reuchlin's influence, because he brought back, in large part, the study of Hebrew to theological and pastoral studies. John Colet was an Englishman, an English humanist, and he was influenced by also some of the Italian humanists. But John Colet in particular is significant because he influences a later humanist named Desiderius Erasmus, who we will talk about in just a moment. But Colet's influence on Erasmus is significant, and Erasmus's contribution to biblical studies and ultimately to the Reformation gives Erasmus the title of being the prince of the humanists, the most significant humanist, at least in terms of his contribution to the Reformation. And then Jacques Lefebvre, really Jacob Faber of Staples, but sounds better when you say it, Jacques Lefebvre de Topolus. So Jacques Lefebvre is a French reformer who highly influenced John Calvin, met with Calvin in 1533, 1534, and influenced Calvin's Institutes, the first edition of which came out in 1536. Lefebvre is significant because he helped translate the Bible into French. And in the same way that Luther translates the Bible into German and Tyndale translates the Bible into English, here we have one of these men translating the Bible into French. And so a very significant French humanistic influence on one of the main reformers, John Calvin himself. Yep?
I think Olson mentions that Calvin was basically reiterating Zwingli. Would you agree with that, or would you kind of say, no, it was really the forever?
There is a lot of Zwingli's influence, certainly, in Calvin's theology. And I think it is fair to say that Zwingli is really in a Reformation sense, Zwingli is the father of Reformed theology. Now, certainly, the distinctives of Reformed theology go back far before Zwingli, and we trace them really all the way back to the New Testament. But Zwingli identified and emphasized a number of key tenets that do show up then in Calvin's Institutes, and that we often associate today with what we call Calvinism. Having said that, Calvin systematized and articulated some of those tenets in a way that made them much more accessible, I think, to people. And I think the reason that history credits Calvin with a lot of maybe Zwingli's initial ideas is because of the way that Calvin was able to express those in his Institutes, and of course then also in his commentaries. So it's not as though Calvin did not make a significant contribution in that process, even though he really, honestly, Calvin is a second-generation reformer if we consider Luther and Zwingli, who were contemporaries as first-generation reformers. Calvin comes about 20 years later. Yeah, so I think that is fair. I'm also glad, because of a number of personal character issues related to Zwingli, which we'll talk about later, I'm glad that it's called Calvinism and not Zwinglianism. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Erasmus. Erasmus is a Dutch humanist, highly influenced by John Colet, as we mentioned. He studied Greek classics under John Colet when he was in England. Erasmus taught at the University of Cambridge, where he mastered the Greek New Testament. And then in 1516 and 1518, he published two works, the Novum Instrumentum and the Novum Testamentum, in which he provided a Greek New Testament, a critical text of the New Testament. It exposed errors in the Vulgate, and it provided a textual critical apparatus for scholars at that time to begin to understand and translate the New Testament. Yep?
So what was the Greek New Testament that he mastered while he was in school?
Well, it wasn't... His contribution was to take all of the available Greek manuscripts that they had at the time, which were largely, if not entirely, part of the majority text family, the Byzantine text family. And he was able to take all of those available manuscripts and produce a critical New Testament. And that critical New Testament represents the real step forward that Erasmus contributed. His critical New Testament, his Greek New Testament, becomes then the foundation that is used by Luther to translate the German New Testament in 1522, and used by Tyndale to translate the English New Testament in 1525. So it's a critical New Testament. There had been some manuscripts that had already been discovered. He brought all of those together and did the process of textual criticism by identifying the best readings that he put together in that Novum Testamentum. All right, I have just a couple sections here from The Praise of Folly. This was published in 1509, and it was considered a satirical and sarcastic, humorous expose of the corruption of the Catholic Church. Erasmus himself never leaves the Catholic Church, so he remains a Catholic all the way to his death. In fact, Luther, who initially really likes Erasmus and certainly benefits from his critical work in the Greek language, gets very, very frustrated later in his life with Erasmus, because Erasmus sounds like a Protestant when he critiques the Catholic Church, and yet he refuses to actually join the Protestant movement. Erasmus also has a major impact on Ulrich Zwingli's life, and we'll talk about him as well later. So we have in Erasmus a man who criticizes openly the Catholic corruption and yet refuses to leave the Catholic Church, probably due to political pressures and the fear of reprisal from Rome if he actually officially broke with the church. So he writes this book on The Praise of Folly, which at the time became an instant bestseller. It was widely known throughout Europe, and it exposed the corruption of the Catholic Church in a humorous way. I think humor's evolved a little bit since this was originally written. It's more or less just biting sarcasm, but the biting sarcasm was something that people thought was funny at the time because it really was a true expression of their own frustrations with a corrupt and broken Roman Catholic system. And again, this is 8 years before the publishing of the 95 Theses. And I'm not going to read all of this, but just a little bit here on the follies of Roman Catholic religious corruption. He has a section here on the monks. So those who call themselves religious and monks, who are most false in both titles, when both a great part of them are the farthest from a religion, and no men swarm thicker in all places than themselves. So they're like busy bees, these monks, under the false pretense of religion. By reason of these fooleries, they not only set slight by others, but each different order, men otherwise professing apostolical charity, despise one another. So the Benedictines despise the Franciscans, and the Franciscans despise the Dominicans. And you have these different orders, and there's a lot of rivalry and strife between them. And Erasmus is saying, these are the guys that are supposed to be showing apostolic love to one another. And why? For the different wearing of a habit. A habit is the robe that a monk would wear. Or that one is of darker color. They put all things into combustion. And among these there are some so rigidly religious that their upper garment is haircloth, and their inner garment of the finest linen. Others wear linen on the outside, and hair next to their skins. Others are as afraid to touch money as poison, and yet neither forbear wine nor dallying with women. In other words, they avoid money, but they're not afraid to get drunk and have illegitimate children. In a word, it's their only care that none of them come near one another in their manner of living, nor do they endeavor how they may be like Christ, but how they may differ among themselves. So, the Dominicans, for example, are not concerned about being like Jesus. They're just concerned about not being associated with the Benedictines or the Franciscans. So, again, this was really, really funny at the time it was written. And I'm gathering from your reactions that you think it's really funny too. He goes on and talks about cardinals. In a like manner, cardinals, if they thought themselves the successors of the apostles, they would likewise imagine that the same things that the apostles did are required of them, and that they are not lords, but dispensers of spiritual things, of which they must shortly give an exact account. Sounds like Peter in 1 Peter 5. And for popes, who supply the place of Christ, if they should endeavor to imitate his life, to wit or to emulate his poverty, labor, doctrine, cross, and contempt of life, or should they consider what the name pope, that is father or holiness, imports? Who would live a more disconsolate life than themselves, or who would purchase that chair with all his substance, or defend it with swords, poisons, and all force imaginable? In other words, if you actually embraced what it was that Christ called the apostles to embrace, then would you really want to buy that level of personal sacrifice and humility with money or protect it with swords? Of course not, but that's what the popes at this time were doing, because they had turned Peter's chair into an opportunity to lord it over people rather than an opportunity to serve. He goes on, so great a profit would the access of wisdom deprive him of. Wisdom, did I say? Nay, the least corn of that salt which Christ speaks of. So much wealth, so much honor, so many riches, so many victories, so many offices, so many dispensations, so much tribute, so many pardons, such horses, mules, guards, and so much pleasure would it lose the Pope if they actually acted like Christ. You see how much I have comprehended in a little? Instead of which it would bring in watchings, fastings, tears, prayers, sermons, good endeavors, sighs, and 1,000 of the like troublesome exercises. Nor is it the least considerable. So many scribes, copying clerks, notaries, advocates, promoters, secretaries, muleteers, grooms, bankers, in short, that vast multitude of men that overcharge the Roman see, I mean honor the Roman see, would have to beg their bread. So the entourage would lose their jobs if the Pope started acting like Christ rather than acting like a king. So there you go. This is 1509 from a Roman Catholic, Erasmus himself, saying this is what the system is like. And Erasmus essentially points out the obvious fact that the system was totally broken. And like I said, people all over Europe, thanks to the printing press, got access to this, and it became kind of the tabloid bestseller of 1509. But even so, Erasmus never leaves the Catholic Church.
How does the Catholic Church view Erasmus, given their stance at that time about the Latin Vulgate staying where it is, and how this kind of led to translations into many languages?
Yeah, they're not real happy with Erasmus, but because Erasmus never officially breaks with Rome, he never faces the execution or persecution that is accorded to heretics. So Erasmus never gets dubbed a heretic because Erasmus never leaves the Catholic Church. But you can see why Luther would be so frustrated with Erasmus later on, because once that break takes place, wouldn't somebody who observes these kinds of things join with those who likewise are protesting all of the corruption? There's another reason, of course, that Erasmus and Luther butt heads, and it has to do with Erasmus's inherent Arminian theology, or at least semi-Pelagian theology. It's not really fair to speak of an Arminian theology before Arminius. That would be a little anti-historical. But Erasmus does represent a semi-Pelagian view. In Erasmus's view, salvation is almost like an apple on a tree, and it's man's job to come and get the ladder and crawl up the ladder and grab the apple. And Luther will respond to that view of Erasmus by writing a book called The Bondage of the Will, which proves that Luther is a Calvinist before Calvin. So if Erasmus is an Arminian before Arminius, Luther is a Calvinist before Calvin. But you have, in The Bondage of the Will, Luther saying, no, there's absolutely no possible way that mankind would ever desire salvation of his own accord because his will is bound to sin. And so Luther articulates really the doctrine of total depravity, which of course Augustine had articulated, and what Paul articulates in Ephesians chapter 2. The Bondage of the Will is a great book. Its one defect, in my opinion, is that Luther spends so much of the time belittling Erasmus that you have to kind of wade through all of the diatribe against Erasmus before you actually get to the substance of what it is that Luther is arguing. Luther spends a lot of his time using his words to, I don't know what the right word is, but he has a lot of harsh things to say about a lot of people, and Erasmus was certainly no exception to that. We're going to talk about Luther here in a moment. Yes?
So why would Luther be called to court for his views, but Erasmus not called, to recant what he said?
Well, Erasmus was never excommunicated from the church, and Luther was. It was in 1520 that Pope Leo III issued a bull of excommunication against Luther, and if he didn't recant, he would be excommunicated. And Luther not only didn't recant, he went out into the middle of Wittenberg and took the bull of excommunication with him, gathered his students around him, and lit a bonfire and lit it on fire. So the idea is, the Pope's threatening to burn me at the stake. Well, I'm going to take his threat and I'm going to burn it at the stake. So Erasmus was critical, but Erasmus stayed in. Luther was critical, and then Luther broke off. And that was perhaps if Reformation hadn't broken out like it did, perhaps Erasmus would have faced more severe consequences for some of the things he said. But by that time, the Catholic Church had a lot more serious threats to worry about than Erasmus. Yep.
You said that the debate goes all the way back to Augustine. Who was Augustine's debating against? Like who was a proponent for free will? Like
Yeah, it was a British monk named Pelagius who had come down to Rome and then eventually made his way, or at least his influence made its way down into North Africa where Augustine was. But Pelagius was trying to encourage, Pelagius was shocked at the worldly lifestyles that people were living in Christian Rome at the time. So these people call themselves Christians, but they're living very worldly lifestyles. And so Pelagius' solution to this was to try and emphasize the importance of good works. But he so overemphasized the importance of good works that he eventually created a system in which good works are able to save a person. Pelagius taught that mankind is basically good, that mankind has a free choice, and in that free choice, if he chooses to do good, then he can essentially be righteous and earn his salvation. And Augustine, when he encountered this doctrine, recognized it for what it is, works salvation, and really railed against it, refuted it, and Pelagianism was then denounced at subsequent church councils as a heresy. Because Augustine rightly taught that mankind cannot please God of his own free will, and that mankind has a free will to a certain extent, but that free will has been utterly contaminated by sin. And so if man is given a choice, man will always choose to reject God. And it is only if God intervenes and quickens a dead heart and opens blind eyes that that sinner will respond in a way that honors and pleases God. But it's God's work, not man's work. And so Augustinianism then comes to be Augustinianism is the orthodox view. It's the orthodox understanding of Scripture. But there's a modification made to it later that we call semi-Pelagianism, which is what the Roman Catholic system ultimately adopts, which is a synergistic system in which there is a cooperation on the part of man along with the work of God. And the Reformation, the Reformers rejected that synergistic system, and rightly so, by emphasizing that really it is only the monergistic work of God in saving the sinner. But Pelagius was the guy back in the 5th century.
Erasmus based his work off of Pelagius' work, the same way Calvin would have used Augustine to...
Yeah, not to my knowledge. I don't think it was a direct correlation. I mean, Pelagius had been declared a heretic, so it wasn't real popular for people to base their thinking within a Roman Catholic system on those who had been deemed heretics in prior centuries. But that semi-Pelagian view, which is what really Erasmus had adopted, was the view of medieval Catholicism as expressed in the sacramental system, because the sacramental system eventually became a system by which man earns his salvation in a synergistic sense. Christ's death infuses a certain amount of righteousness, and then the believer, the sinner, he performs a certain amount of good works, and together Christ's good work and the sinner's good works render that sinner justified, which is what the Reformation doctrine of sola fide was against. So any level of human cooperation in the process really is a reflection of that medieval Catholic view and not a reflection of the Augustinian view of the 5th century, Augustine interpreting Paul in Romans and in Ephesians and in other places. Okay, well, let's move on past Erasmus to talk about Martin Luther. And with our introduction of Martin Luther, we really get now into the beginnings of the Reformation proper. And this is where, when you think of the Reformation, this is where most people begin with Martin Luther, even though I've challenged you in this class to consider the Reformation as something that's a little bit bigger than just one person and certainly bigger than just one date in 1517. For our discussion of Luther, I'm going to switch over and use PowerPoint. You do have these slides on Joule as PDF slides, so you have access to all of this information in addition to what's in the syllabus. But I want to use this to discuss the life and impact of this man. In all likelihood, we will not finish this today. We will have to finish this next week because Luther's impact is such that he deserves more than just a half hour of our time. Luther was born in November of 1483. Ulrich Zwingli, who is his contemporary, will have been born just 7 weeks later in actually January 1st of 1484. So when we think about the Reformation starting in Germany under Luther, starting in Switzerland under Zwingli, these two movements really take place at the same time by two men who were very much contemporaries. Just 7 weeks separated their birthdays. Luther's parents, his father was a successful miner and he also represents kind of that middle class, merchant class that is developing during this time period. And as a result, Luther was well educated and had opportunities to study initially in an effort to become a lawyer. In fact, Luther was planning to become a lawyer. Luther's dad wanted him to be a lawyer, and Luther graduated from university with a degree in law. He got his master's degree in law. He was getting a doctor's degree in law when God interrupted his life and sent him in a very different direction. Here are some of the main places in Germany, which of course was part of the Holy Roman Empire at that time, but the main places in Germany of Luther's life. And so he was born in Eisleben and only lived there for less than 2 years before his family moved. And ironically enough, Luther has the distinction of being born and dying in the same town, even though he didn't live hardly any of his life in that place. So he was born there, moved before or when he was 2 years old with his parents, and then spent his entire life elsewhere. And it was almost just a providential coincidence that he was traveling back through that area when he died in the 1540s. So Eisleben, if you visit Eisleben, I had an opportunity to visit Eisleben a few years ago. You can visit both his birth house and his death house, which are both museums. And there's Eisleben today. And there's the room where Luther was born. And I don't really know what significance that has for our class, except there you go. His family moved to Mansfeld in 1484. His father found economic success there, Magdeburg and Eisenach, and as a young man he received training in grammar, rhetoric, and logic, the typical medieval scholastic trivium, which was what education at that time period consisted of. But I think it's helpful for us to recognize that Luther was highly educated. Sometimes he's portrayed as kind of this ignorant peasant monk, but the reality is he came from a fairly affluent family, not an aristocratic family, but a fairly affluent family, and he was also highly educated and himself a lawyer by training and then a Bible scholar, as we certainly are well aware of. Here is the house where he lived and where he was educated in Eisenach. He continued his education enrolling in the University of Erfurt, and then after receiving his master's degree in law, he continued by pursuing a doctor of law also at Erfurt. This is where the story picks up with Luther in terms of how God was going to shape him and mold him and use him for reforming purposes. It was on July 2nd, and you're probably already familiar with the story, but it was on July 2nd, 1505, as he was walking home from law school, that he found himself in the midst of a severe thunderstorm. Lightning was crashing all around him. Did that make sense? Lightning was flashing all around him. I suppose the thunder was doing the crashing, but either way, Luther thought he was going to die. And in good Roman Catholic fashion, Luther called out to the patron saint of miners. His father, of course, was in the mining industry, so their family's patron saint was Saint Anne. Saint Anne, save me, and I will become a monk. Obviously, Saint Anne was not there to hear him, but in God's providence, God answers that prayer and preserves Luther's life. And 15 days later, Luther makes good on his promise. It's actually pretty amazing that Luther made good on his promise. Erasmus, in one of his other writings about how corrupt the system of his day was, tells a story about a sinking ship where all of these good Roman Catholics are on the sinking ship, and the ship's going down and it's breaking apart and they're clinging on to driftwood. And we have people making all sorts of promises, according to Erasmus, to all sorts of patron saints of all the things they're going to do if they're spared. And then once they're spared, they don't end up keeping the promise. But Luther, and I think it is an insight into his own personal character and certainly the level of guilt and conviction that he feels, Luther makes good on his promise. And it wasn't easy to do because his father was absolutely furious that all of this money he had invested in his son's law education was suddenly going to be lost, and Luther was going to leave law school and join a monastery. Now, becoming a monk was a decent career choice at that time from just a purely economic standpoint. If you became a monk, you were taken care of for the rest of your life, and that was something that peasant farmers and even middle-class miners didn't have guaranteed to them. But being a lawyer was even better. And of course, even today, being a pastor is a good career choice from an economic standpoint. Being a lawyer is perhaps even more lucrative. And obviously, we're not motivated by money. That's not why we do what we do. But in Luther's father's case, he was upset about Luther's decision. What's interesting about this is when we get to Calvin, Calvin's dad also wants Calvin to become a lawyer because lawyers make more money than priests. And there's some interesting correlations between their two lives. This is the monastery at Erfurt. It is an Augustinian monastery that Luther joined in 1505. Just 15 days after he was nearly struck down by lightning, and a door and entrance to the monastery there. And then one of my favorite signs that I think we should put all over the library here at TMS, the cloisters are a place of silence. I don't know, cloister has kind of a Catholic overtone to it, but the word itself just means a place that's kind of hidden away. And the cubicles downstairs, we need more of these signs. All right. I just like the German of it. Yeah.
Is that sign suggesting that there's still monks there?
There are still monks there, but they're Lutheran. All right, so here's an inside picture of the monastery at Erfurt. And this is the cell where Luther stayed when he was there, and a plaque outside with the habit that he wore. And the white rose, just looking at the picture here, the white rose on the floor is significant because the white rose comes to be kind of Luther's symbol, and we'll talk a little bit more about why he chose a white rose as his symbol. But in the same way that John Calvin is associated with a tulip, which is actually kind of ironic because Calvin himself probably cared less about tulips during his own lifetime. He didn't come up with tulip. That was not an invention, an articulation that was later the outcome of the Synod of Dort, which was after Calvin was dead. But in any case, we associate tulips with Calvin, and now I'm giving you a flower you can associate with Luther, the white rose. And again, we'll talk about why that was his symbol a little later on. Was there a hand? Yep.
Yeah, I'm sorry
Aaron.
to interrupt, but I just can't get over. So Luther, who rebelled against them monastic system and left monasticism and even went on tirades against it and wrote against that whole system. Now there are monks who consider themselves Lutheran. How does that, that's a confusing thing.
Well, I'll have to go back and look at exactly what it is that takes place inside the monastery. My recollection, though, from having been there a few years ago, is that there are still Lutheran pastors or Lutheran students of some kind who make use of the monastery for educational purposes. I don't know that they would refer to themselves as monks. It certainly was not a monastic system in the same way that we think of the Catholic monastic system. So I'll do a little bit more looking on that to see exactly what it is that goes on there. It was just my recollection from having been there that this monastery is still in use for some level of education and other spiritual formation purposes. But I'm not remembering exactly how it's used today. I don't know. Maybe somebody out there with Google can check for us. This is the habit that was worn during the time that Martin Luther spent here in this monastery. So that would have been the habit that the Augustinian monks wore during his time. Johann von Staupitz was the head of that particular monastery. He was the confessor to whom Luther confessed his sins. And in fact, Luther was so introspective. Luther came to the monastery, and during his time there, at least his first few years there, Luther was overwhelmed by a sense of his own guilt and unworthiness before a holy God. And Luther, more than any of the other monks there in the monastery, would go to extreme lengths to perform acts of penance to pay for his sin. So he would lay on the cold floor there in this monastery, where especially in winter things were freezing, there is no central heat. He would lay on the cold floor without a blanket to pay for his sins. He would whip himself in forms of asceticism. He would fast and starve himself. And in fact, his health was permanently damaged as a result of his efforts to try and earn his own salvation. And he would have health problems for the rest of his life as a result of some of the torture that he put himself through during his time here at the monastery in Erfurt. He would confess his sins to this man, Johann von Staupitz. He would confess his sins to him, and he would confess longer and in more detail than anyone else. And at times he would come back and wake up von Staupitz in the middle of the night to continue confessing sins, to the point where this man, von Staupitz, got completely tired of it and tried to tell Luther to, ease up. So one of the ways that I remember von Staupitz's name is that he kept telling Luther to stop it. Staupitz, stop coming and always confessing your sins to me. Von Staupitz actually would be a very significant influence on Luther's life, and after Luther kind of breaks with the Roman Catholic Church, von Staupitz is still, in Luther's mind, a close ally and mentor in this entire process. So an important individual there at the monastery. As I mentioned, he was highly introspective. He was concerned deeply with personal guilt and the need for salvation. 1507, he was ordained to the priesthood. 1508, he began teaching at Wittenberg in theology. He's only 25 years old at this time. He earns his doctorate in 1512. And all the while, he is still very, very consumed with the fact that God is holy and he is a sinner, and so he's trying to do things to make himself right and pay for his own sins. That's the whole Roman Catholic system of penance, that you pay for your own sins, and Luther is consumed with his overwhelming feeling of guilt and fear. Yep?
Did Staupitz also break from the church too, or did he just stay at the church when Luther broke off?
Yeah, my understanding is that he went with the Lutheran reforms, because pretty much all of those monasteries and cathedrals in that part of Germany became Protestant once the Protestant Reformation fully broke from the Catholic Church. We're at a time in church history where there is no such thing as a separation between church and state. So when a province, in the case of Germany or Switzerland, or when a country, in the case of England, when they go Protestant, everybody that lives there goes Protestant. Or you either move or you convert. And if you're in a Catholic area, everybody's Catholic. So it's not like you go into town and you're like, oh, there's the Catholic Church and there's the Protestant Church. Things that we're used to here. In this situation, the government and religion are hand in hand. And if the government chooses Protestantism, everybody, every church, every monk becomes Protestant. And to not convert is to be a traitor against the government. I mentioned to you already in a previous class period how Luther traveled to Rome in 1510 and was completely disillusioned by what he saw there. But he traveled there out of his angst. Well, he was given the opportunity to go there, but he was excited to go there out of his angst and out of his guilt, because he felt like they would have the answers to his spiritual questions. And when he got there, he realized that not only did they not have the answers he was looking for, but that the entire system was entirely corrupt. It was corrupt through and through, all the way to the core, from the bottom all the way up to through the cardinals to the Pope himself. And as I mentioned, when Philip Schaff describes this, he mentions the fact that Luther heard the Romans themselves say that if there was a hell, their own city must have been built on it, because the corruption that was so flagrant was there before them in the lives of the cardinals and priests and Pope of Rome. Luther came back, and while he is at the monastery in Erfurt, he begins to understand justification. Really, it's as he is lecturing in Wittenberg through the book of Romans, also through the book of Psalms and the book of Galatians, that Luther starts to understand the doctrine of justification by faith. In Luther's own testimony, when he got to Romans 1:16, where it says that it is in the gospel, where Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed. That phrase, the righteousness of God, Luther in his own testimony says that he hated that phrase. He hated it because all he saw in that phrase was his own condemnation, because he viewed it as the righteous standard of God, and he knew that he fell short of that righteous standard. But as he began to study the book of Romans, and also as he read through the Psalms, a great portion of the Old Testament that exalts God for his mercy and grace, and then as he read through the book of Galatians, that wonderful text in which Paul makes it so clear that we are justified by faith and not the works of the law, Luther suddenly came to understand that the righteousness of God that is revealed in the gospel is not only the righteous requirement of God, by which everyone stands condemned, but it is also the righteous provision of God, as Paul explains in Romans 4 and 5 and on through there, that it is the righteous provision of God, the justification that comes through faith by grace on the basis of Christ's righteousness. Luther wrote of his time in the monastery, just speaking of how intent he was on trying to work his way to heaven. If ever a monk got to heaven by being a monk, by monkery, I would have gotten there. In other words, if you could get to heaven by being a good person, I would have gotten to heaven. But as he studied the righteousness of God in Romans 1:16 and 17, he came to understand that justification is a single act of God, whereby God declares the sinner righteous rather than a gradual synergistic process of faith mixing with good works. So here is Luther's testimony, and this comes from, we believe, the year 1515. When Luther finally recognized the glorious truth of justification by faith and the righteous provision of God at the cross. Here's what Luther said, at last. And I think you can, the thing that we love about Luther, look, Luther is extreme. Luther is extreme in just about every aspect. Luther experiences extreme emotions. He experiences times of severe depression, but he experiences time also of supreme delight and supreme exaltation. He is almost pure emotion. He's the emotion of the Reformation. He stands in contrast to Calvin, who's so cerebral and understated that when Calvin says anything, you almost have to magnify it by 100 in order to get the true sense of emotion that Calvin's trying to express. With Luther, you have to divide it by 100 to bring it back to some semblance of normalness. But the poignancy and the emotion that reverberates throughout all of Luther's writings, I think it's that humanness that makes him so beloved by so many, because we can resonate with those emotions. So you can see the emotion in Luther's own testimony when he says, at last, it's been 10 years since he entered a monastery, 10 years of starving himself and sleeping on a cold floor without a blanket and whipping himself and taking trips to Rome only to come home disillusioned, 10 years of living in fear and angst and trepidation at the reality that if he were to die, he knew that all the things he had done were not enough to save him. 10 years of that. At last, by the mercy of God, meditating day and night, I gave heed to the context of the words. Namely, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, as it is written, he who through faith is righteous shall live. There I began to understand that the righteousness of God is that by which the righteous lives by a gift of God, namely by faith. And this is the meaning. The righteousness of God is revealed by the gospel, namely the passive righteousness with which merciful God justifies us by faith, meaning an alien righteousness, the righteousness of Christ imputed to our account. As it is written, he who through faith is righteous shall live. Here I felt that I was altogether born again, and had entered paradise itself through open gates. And there a totally other face of the entire Scripture showed itself to me. So for a decade, all Luther had been able to see was judgment, 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 and wrath. And now Luther discovers grace and mercy and, the joy of the gospel. And his own personal reformation then precedes what we think of when we think of the Reformation that shakes the foundations of Catholicism and the church in Europe.
Before this discovery, what would he have understood faith to be? Or maybe even what do Catholics today consider faith?
Yeah, well, the Catholic Catechism talks a lot about faith, but it talks about faith as being only one part of what a person must do to attain salvation. So you believe, but you also must be baptized, and you also must keep the 10 Commandments, and you also must observe certain sacraments, and you must be part of the Roman Catholic Church. And your own, what they call, according to the Catholic Encyclopedia, formal justification is something that is really a purification process that involves not only the infused righteousness of Christ, which kind of is the initial thing that gets you into this relationship with God, but it involves your own penance and your own good works. So you purify yourself in the Roman Catholic system of justification. And in this life, you purify yourself through acts of penance, where you pay, at least in a temporal sense, for your own sins. And for those sins that are not paid for in this life, the ones that get missed through confession or through last rites when you die, you go to purgatory and you continue to purge yourself until you finally reach a place of perfection. And at that point, you're allowed into heaven. Because only perfect people can get into heaven, and you have to perfect yourself. And Luther realized he couldn't perfect himself. And when he came to that realization, initially it was nothing but hopelessness. Because if the standard is perfection and you can't perfect yourself, then you're hopeless and helpless. And then God used that to show him the true gospel of grace. And the emotion that he expresses is one of the relief of a sinner who has spent the last 10 years of his life trying to get to heaven and consistently realizing that he couldn't get there on his own. You know, I mean, it's the work of the Holy Spirit to draw and to convict. You know, John chapter 16, Jesus talks about how the Spirit convicts the world of sin and judgment and righteousness. That's what was happening during this period of time. The Spirit was convicting Luther of his sin and of the righteous standard that he couldn't meet and of the judgment of God that was going to fall on him if he were to die in his sin, no matter how much penance he tried to do. And then the Spirit regenerated him, and the Spirit converted him by quickening his dead soul, Ephesians 2:4, by bringing light to his blind eyes, 2 Corinthians 4, and allowing Luther to see for the first time the mercy and grace that is inherent in the gospel, which he had been blind to that previous decade as a Roman Catholic monk. And now, as a born-again believer, everything is about to change. Yep, Trevor.
Like in that faith comes by hearing and hearing from the Word of God, would it be fair to say that these people did not really hear the Word of God taught at this time? Would they have only been hearing Catholic theology through catechism and oral traditions? Like, would they be hearing or being preached to expositorily?
The common people, the lay people who go to Mass every Sunday at this time period, they're not hearing anything that they understand. So they go and they sit and they watch a choir sing in Latin, and then they hear a priest say something in Latin, and once a year they're able to eat a piece of bread, and the priest gives them a blessing that's in Latin, and then they go home, and that was church. So the lay people at this time have really no understanding about anything except that there's a lot of stuff that happens that, you know, sounds like something out of Harry Potter. The Reformation is going to change all of that because there will be the rediscovery of biblical preaching, and Luther will begin to preach. I mean, even before that, of course, Waldo is preaching in the language of the people. Wycliffe is translating the Bible into English. Huss is preaching in the Bohemian language of the people of Prague. And now, thanks to humanism, the ancient manuscripts of Greek and Hebrew have been rediscovered, and the Bible is starting to come alive again within the realm of scholarship in Western Europe. And the Bible is now being translated into French by Lefebvre, and into German by Luther, and into English by Tyndale. And the result of this now is that the Word of God is coming to bear on people's lives. And as they are exposed to the Scriptures, the Spirit quickens their hearts, and they are converted. And the result is what we call the Reformation, the greatest revival in church history. Luther's own conversion was his studying of the Scriptures. Studying Psalms, studying Romans, studying Galatians, which in God's providence, I mean, you couldn't pick. I mean, all of Scripture, of course, is inspired, and the Spirit can use any part of Scripture to convict the heart. But you really couldn't pick 3 better books for trying to disciple somebody in what the essence of God's grace and mercy in the gospel is. And as he discovers that truth, it just transforms his life, and then God uses him to transform the Western world. Yep.
How did if they conducted the services all in Latin, how did they communicate the traditions that, as good Catholics, they were supposed to follow? How was that communicated? Was it communicated in the vernacular in some kind of pamphlet, or
Yeah, I'm sure there would have been some instruction that was given to lay people about certain aspects of church life that would have taken place in the vernacular. But in the church service proper, everything takes place in the official language of theology, which for 1,000 years in Western Europe has been Latin. Initially because people spoke Latin, but now because that's the tradition. And certainly clergy members who are all trained priests, when they go into the monasteries, they learn Latin, and then they are taught how to conduct these religious services using the language of theology. Okay, this is the Castle Church there in Wittenberg. This is the church where Luther will nail his 95 Theses to the castle door. And this is 2 years now after his conversion. And Luther's 95 Theses are written in response to the sale of indulgences. Luther's own thinking about all of the corruption in the Catholic Church and his own distancing from Catholic theology, it's something that takes a little bit of a process. Yes, he's been converted. Yes, he has seen the true gospel. Yes, he has embraced Christ in faith. And yet it's still going to be a few years before Luther fully sees all of the ramifications of what it means to want to reform the church. And Luther's intent initially, of course, is not to break off from the Catholic Church. It's to purify the Catholic Church from within, because the Catholic Church is the only church. So he wants to reform the church. It starts with his complaint about indulgences. And we'll read some of the 95 Theses next week when we come back. But the Cardinal Albert of Hohenzollern had commissioned a monk named Johann Tetzel to go around and sell these indulgences. And remember, indulgences are essentially certificates. They're almost like spiritual gift cards. The idea is that the Pope has this grace that he can distribute and dispense these credits, this extra credit that he can dispense to people that gets them less time in purgatory. And it can also be applied to some of your dead relatives. So if you really loved your parents or your grandparents before they died, this would be a great way to honor their memory and get them to heaven a little bit faster. And this, of course, is a very effective sales technique for raising money for the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church right now is building St. Peter's Basilica, which of course is the famous one that has paintings by Michelangelo on the ceiling. They're building that right now. They need money to pay for it. And it is an amazing building, but it was built on the backs of poor people all throughout Europe who contributed money to a false system whereby they thought they were getting time out of purgatory. And it was really just a sham. And Luther recognized it for what it is. And it's essentially a 16th century version of what goes on every TBN Praise-a-thon, where people send their hard-earned money for something that's not true. And this made Luther really, really mad that his people, under his spiritual care there in the town of Wittenberg, that they would use their money, their bread money, their rent money, their hard-earned money, they would use it to pay for a building project in Rome built on a pretense of getting time out of purgatory in exchange for cash. And, this would make me really mad. It made Luther really mad. And it made Luther mad enough that he sat down and wrote a blog article about it. And he listed 95 reasons why this was ridiculous. Now, his blog article, of course, was on paper, and it was in Latin because it was initially intended for inter-clergy debate, but it got translated, and thanks to the printing press, it got distributed, and suddenly, within about a month, everyone in Germany had a copy of these 95 reasons, and they were all like, hey, I think these are 95 really good reasons why I shouldn't have given my money to that guy who came to town and took it. And the result then is going to be Reformation. There's a picture of Albert of Hohenzollern and a picture of Johann Tetzel, the German monk, and then a picture of Tetzel selling his indulgences. And just for fun, guys ask me sometimes, you know, the famous slogan, as soon as a coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. People sometimes ask, did it really rhyme in German? And the answer is yes, it really did, because klingt and springt do rhyme in German. And so that slogan was the actual slogan that Tetzel was using as he went from town to town, convincing people to part with their hard-earned money for a certificate of paper that said the Pope grants you a certain amount of time out of purgatory.
Had Luther traveled to Rome by this time?
Yes, Luther had traveled to Rome in 1510, and this is 7 years later in 1517. So Luther had firsthand exposure to the corruption and to the way that that money was being used to, you know, pay for the lavish lifestyles and extravagant building projects that were going on in the Vatican. You know, and you can go today to Vatican City and you can see some of those extravagant building projects, which they really are magnificent pieces of architecture, but they're also kind of monuments to the corruption that characterized this time period.
In the movie, you see Luther really doing a bit of stand-up in his mocking of Rome. Is that an accurate portrayal of Luther? And like his sarcastic humor was most outstanding. It was really impressive. I was just wondering, was he like that? Was that just a movie embellishment?
Well, I think at this point in Luther's life, there may have been some of that sarcasm starting to show, and we'll see that when we read through some of the 95 Theses. We won't read them all, but we'll read some of them. You start to see it. But certainly after 1519 with the Leipzig debates, after 1520 with the Bull of Excommunication, after 1521 with the Diet of Worms, when Luther finally gets back to Wittenberg in 1522, he is absolutely a Protestant by that point. So at this point, in the 95 Theses, he still kind of gives the Pope the benefit of the doubt every once in a while. And guys read that and they get confused. It's because it's still part of the process. 5 years from now, he will be diametrically opposed, and in his future writings about the Catholic Church, there will very much be that sarcasm. I mean, Luther said a lot of harsh things about a lot of people, but the worst and most, worst isn't the right word, the most biting and cutting sarcasm and the most despicable word images that he employed to describe other people, he reserved for the Pope and the Catholic Church. And he even had Cranach, his local artist, draw graphic cartoons that depicted the Pope doing all sorts of very deplorable and disgusting things. I mean, cartoons that we wouldn't even be able to publish in a paper for fear of people under the age of 18 seeing them. So, I mean, he was very angry at the Catholic Church, and he took every opportunity to mock it and to expose it for what he saw it as being, a corrupt religious system. So, I don't think that that harshness was unwarranted on Luther's part. It's just not, it's not PG sometimes.